What if Cyclonic Rift was free? What if Colossal Dreadmaw was an equipment? What if you could storm off with frogs? It's time for more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffrada, and it's time for another daily dose of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So we're slowly creeping to the end of main set spoilers, although today, Commander spoilers kick off with the 4 Commander precons coming out over the next 3 days. Tomer's going to be covering those on the MTGGoldfish Commander channel, so make sure to look out for that. But today, we still have some super ridiculous cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking new modern cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Modern Horizons 3. First up today, we get a absolutely ridiculous new Mythic in Ugin's Binding, and I gotta say, Modern Horizons 3 been a pretty good set for Ugin, even though there's no Ugin in the set. Between Ugin's Labyrinth and Ugin's Binding, Ugin's gotten a couple of the best cards in the entire set. So Ugin's Binding, 3 mana blue, but technically not blue, cause it has Devoid, instant. This says, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. So a bad bounce spell, 3 mana bounce spell. But then, when you cast a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater, you may exile it from your graveyard. When you do, return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. So that's right, once this is in your graveyard and you cast a big colorless thing, you Cyclonic Rift your opponents for free, which is ridiculous. So as I mentioned before, casting this the first time from your hand, not great. Like, Disperse is 2 mana to bounce a non-land permanent, and that's not even close to playable in Modern. So 3 mana to bounce a single thing, pretty bad rate, like very unplayable. The upside of this card though is once it's in your graveyard, it becomes ridiculous. And this calls back to like Kozilek's Return, kind of the same formatting. You pay attacks on a Pyroclasm, but then when you cast a big thing, in this case it specifically had to be an Eldrazi with mana value 7 or greater. Ugin's Binding a little bit better because it's just a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater. You can exile it, deal 5 damage to each creature. Ugin's Binding, I think, is just way better than Kozilek's Return. The upside is you don't have to be Eldrazi, which is huge. That opens up more possibilities for this card. Plus, it gets rid of all non-land permanents. Unfortunately for Kozilek's Return, 5 damage to everything might kill some of your stuff, which is kind of awkward. Ugin's Binding, never going to bounce your own stuff. And then 5 damage might not even kill all your opponent's stuff depending on the situation. So Ugin's Binding, I think this card is kind of insane. Like, it's a Cyclonic Rift for free from your graveyard. So how do you take advantage of this card? So number one, works really well with any affinity stuff. Sojourner's Companion, Mirror Enforcers. Affinity has a lot of these 7 mana colorless spells that are technically 0 mana in an affinity deck. So once you get Ugin's Binding in your graveyard, you just cast one of these for free thanks to affinity, bounce all your opponent's stuff, clear the way for your big like Simulacrum Synthesizer constructs. That's one thing I've noticed from playing the Simulacrum Synthesizer deck quite a bit is, yeah, the constructs are huge, but they do get chump block really easily. I'm imagining with this, you can make a couple of constructs and then just use Ugin's Binding, bounce all your opponent's stuff, swing with the constructs, win the game on the spot. Also pretty interesting in like Mono Blue Tron. Mono Blue Tron, not the dominant force of Tron, but still Mono Blue Tron's going to be playing Karn Liberateds, maybe Ugins, maybe Sundering Titans, Ulamogs, a bunch of big colorless things, and then you got all your bounce spells and so forth. Maybe this could replace like a Repeal or some sort of like tempo-y plan, where then you're able to eventually cast your big thing, make your opponent pick up all their stuff, which might not win you the game right away, like with Simulacrum Synthesizer constructs, but still, it's going to make sure your opponent can't attack your Karn, can't attack your Ugin, because they got nothing on board, so it seems great there as well. Obviously, also designed to work really well with Eldrazi, so if you're Null Drifting, or Devour and Destinying, or Emrakul the World Renewing, any big Eldrazi stuff, gonna be great there too. And it works really, really well with Emerge stuff. So we've seen Emerge kind of like come back a little bit with Harrogast. We'll see if it actually develops into like a real deck. But Emerge, kind of like the Affinity for Artifact stuff, give you a way that you can cheat these expensive 8 mana colorless things into play at a much lower rate. The other exciting thing about Emerge is you get cards like Elder Deep Fiend, which have Flash, and then you could turn this into a real Cyclonic Rift, where you wait to your opponent's end step, and then you Emerge your Elder Deep Fiend, and your opponent picks up all your stuff. stuff, and then you're able to just attack and win the game. So there's a bunch of homes for this card. So I think Ugin's Binding is obviously not a card that can go in every deck, right? You gotta have colorless spells with mana value 7 or greater, and you gotta be okay with playing this like kind of overcosted Disperse to start out. But in the decks that can do it, this card is insane. Commander, it's kind of the same deal. If you're playing big affinity stuff, if you're playing big Eldrazi stuff, if you're playing Emerge stuff, the card's gonna be really good. It also works really well with a couple of additional commanders in specific. One of the biggest is Morophon the Boundless. So Morophon is this weird default for any tribal deck that doesn't really have a commander that happens to be a 7 mana colorless card. So if you're playing Morophon, I think I would play this every time. Even if I don't have any other big colorless things in my deck, I would just trust that my Morophon is now also going to eventually be my Cyclonic Rift, which is kind of insane. And I imagine in a Morophon deck, it probably just closes out the game. You just build up a big board, cast your Morophon, your opponents have to pick up all their stuff, then you swing in and kill your opponent. Also queue with Memnarch, which happens to be a 7 mana artifact commander, although you have to pay full price for Memnarch, but still I would play it there as well. If you have a colorless commander with mana value 7 or greater, I think this is worth putting in your deck, and then it's really good in the Eldrazi decks, in the affinity decks, thanks to the cards in the 99. So Ugin's Binding, I think this card can see modern play. I think it can be really solid in those affinity decks, in those Eldrazi decks that can easily trigger it. And then in Commander, if you can trigger it, the card's ridiculous. Cyclonic Rift is one of the strongest cards in the entire format, and a Cyclonic Rift for free when you cast your commander or cast some big colorless thing sounds like an absolutely ridiculous card. We also got a cute new little 2-drop bestow landfall creature in Springheart Nantuko. So a 2-mana 1/1 insect monk. It also has bestow of 2 mana, and it gives enchanted creature +1/+1. So you can cast it as an aura on one of your creatures for 2 mana, or just play it as a creature for 2 mana. And then it has landfall. When a land ETBs under your control, you can pay 1 and a green if it's attached to a creature you control. If you do, you create a token that's a copy of that creature. If you didn't create a token this way, then you create a 1/1 green insect creature token. So that wording's a little wonky. Essentially what this means is you can just play this as a 2-mana 1/1 creature, and it has landfall, make a 1/1 green insect, or you can play it as an aura for 2 mana on a creature, and then you have landfall, pay 1 and a green to make a copy of that creature, or if you choose not to do that, you'll still get the 1/1 green insect creature token. So Springheart Nantuko is notable because it's the new cheapest landfall, make a token creature, and this might actually matter a lot to Modern. So I've been trying to work on a Nadu Winged Wisdom combo deck. If you don't remember Nadu from a couple of days ago, it's that weird bird that whenever you target one of your things with anything, or anyone targets your things with anything, you kind of do like a Coiling Oracle. You reveal a card. If it's a land, it goes into play. Otherwise, it goes into your hand. And it gives that ability to all your creatures twice each turn. So the easiest way to combo with this is to have some sort of landfall, make a token creature. I was going to go with Scoot Swarm because that was the cheapest option available. But now I think Springheart Nantuko is just better. So what you do is you get down Nadu, you get down your Scoot Swarm, or down your Springheart Nantuko, and then you just keep equipping your creatures with Lightning Greaves for free or Shuko for free, and you trust that as you move these equipment around, you're going to trigger Nadu. It's eventually going to hit a land, which is going to make a token, and then that token is going to gain Nadu's ability, where you can target it twice with one of these equipment to draw 2 more cards, hopefully hit another land to make another token. In theory, if you build your deck right and run a little bit well, you should be able to just draw your entire deck. And with Springheart Nantuko, you can do this as early as turn 3. The other problem with Scoot Swarm is it's a little bit expensive, right? It's at the same spot on the curve with Nadu. Now in theory you can go turn 1 Shuku, turn 2 Springheart Nantuko, turn 3 Nadu. You immediately get 4 Nadu triggers by moving around the Shuko. As long as you hit a land in your top 4 cards, you keep the process going, eventually go infinite, win the game, draw your deck, all the lands come into play on tap, so then you just like Thassa's Oracle or whatever and win the game. The other thing about this deck is it's going to work really well with Ephemerate. Remember, the lands come into play untapped, so if you play some Ephemerates or other blink effects in your deck, as you eventually draw through your deck, you'll hit a blink effect, you can use it to reset Nadu, and that'll let all your creatures be targeted 2 more times with the equipment and still trigger the ability, which then should let you go fully infinite and literally just draw your entire deck on turn 3. So Springheart Nantuko, really big deal for that deck. The biggest weakness it still has is it is a 1/1, so it still does die to Orcish Bowmasters, which is a little bit awkward, but Scoot Swarm kind of had that same problem. So I think that's one of the big upsides of this card, the new cheapest landfall token producer. The other upside of this card is it can kind of turn any of your creatures into into a Scoot Swarm. It is worth mentioning, you do gotta pay mana if you want to copy the creature that you bestow on. It is 2 mana, but that's still pretty good. It's like a repeatable phantasmal image, and I imagine you could put this on, you know, a random 1-drop Delighted Halfling Esper Sentinel, play a fetch land, be able to crack it, and pay some mana on turn 3 and get a copy of it. It gets even better once you get to like 2-drops and you're able to copy your Territorial Kavus or Tarmogoyfs or Orcish Bowmasters. I will say this mode, outside of dedicated combos, I'd be surprised if it was actually good enough, because you do need to pay mana. If it was actually like Scoot Swarm, where you just got a copy of it for free, the card would be absolutely absurd. But I think since you have to pay 2 mana to make a copy of it, it's going to be a little bit slow. Imagine like you play Tarmogoyf on turn 2, on turn 3 you play Springheart Nantuko on the Tarmogoyf, you only got 1 mana left over, so you can't like play and crack a fetch and pay for its ability, so it's going to be a little slow to get going. So I think the card's really fun, and it's still notable as a clone, just because green doesn't really get these creature cloning effects. Green doesn't copy things that are already on the battlefield. It's more of a blue thing. So it seems like a pretty big color pie break, or at least a pretty big color pie blend, which makes it interesting. And it could be pretty fun in some sort of like Auras deck, where imagine you like put this on your Slippery Boggle, and then you start making copies of your Slippery Boggle, or your Core Spirit Dancer, or whatever. So Springheart Nantuko, I think the card's really good. Just being a cheap landfall token producer has implications in modern decks, and definitely in like landfall commander decks. People love their Scoot Swarms in commander, and then the ability to use it to copy a Biovisionary a bunch of times and try to use it to win the game as you're playing your fetch lands is pretty cute too. Next up, we get a ridiculous new cat 1-drop in Ocelot Pride. So Ocelot Pride, 1 mana 1/1 cat. It has First Strike and Lifelink, and it has Ascend. So once you get to 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing and you ascend for the rest of the game. And then it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, create a 1/1 white creature token. Then if you have the City's Blessing, for each token you control that entered the battlefield this turn, create a token that's a copy of it. So Ocelot Pride is a pretty ridiculous army in a can card. It's one of those 1-drops that, if it goes unchecked, can snowball into a victory pretty much by itself. It starts making cats thanks to lifelink, maybe on turn 2. Those cats get you towards ascending, and then once you ascend, then even just by itself, you're going to get 2 1/1 cat tokens each turn. So this is the 1-drop that can pretty much dominate the game if it sticks on the battlefield. And I think there's multiple potential homes for this card. So one is, could be good in Soul Sisters. Soul Sisters give you the life gain, and then Ocelot Pride will always be making a token, which you can use to kind of like stabilize and build a big board in Ascend and then make more tokens. So that's one possibility. Could be a Soul Sisters card. It also seems like a good cat card. We got New Ajani, who's Planeswalker side in specific, all about cats, pumping cats, taking advantage of cats. Plus, cats have been kind of close to being good in Modern with King of the Pride and Pride Sovereign and Regal Caracal. And this card really seems designed to work in cat decks, because cats tend to care about 2 things, which is gaining life. They have a lot of lifelink and tokens that have lifelink, and also token production is kind of what cats do. Pride is Sovereign, Regal Caracal. So Ocelot Pride really works perfectly with what cats are trying to do, which is gain a bunch of life, make a bunch of tokens, eventually overwhelm your opponent. So cats, I don't know, they haven't really been great in Modern. They've never been great in Modern, and they've gotten worse in Modern since Solitude came around and can just easily snipe Pride Sovereigns and Regal Caracals and King of the Pride. But maybe Ocelot Pride is that little boost of power along with the Johnny they need to become good again. The other possibility is this card gets kind of ridiculous in a token deck thanks to that last ability. Maybe you're playing like a straight up Lingering Soul Spectral Procession token deck. In those decks, you could easily be making 5 1/1 tokens in a turn, and then once you get the City's Blessing, which you'll get really quickly if you're making that many tokens, Ocelot Pride is kind of like token Mnemonicon, where on your end step it's just going to double up all the tokens that you made. You do need a way to gain life to make that work, but that should be easy to do. So that's the good news. There's a bunch of different places where this cat could show up, and it's a 1-drop that, if it sticks out and does its thing, can snowball into a victory. But there is bad news, one really huge piece of bad news, and that bad news is Orcish Bowmasters. So we've talked at length this spoiler season about how Wizards seem to have designed Modern Horizons 3 with Orcish Bowmasters in mind. We see a lot of creatures that would normally probably be 1/1s be like a 1/2, so they don't die to Bowmasters. Ocelot Pride, it's a 1/1, so it dies to Bowmasters, and this tells me one of 2 things, and I'm not sure which one it is. So one possibility is Wizards playtested Ocelot Pride, probably with more toughness, and found that the card is so incredibly pushed and so incredibly strong that they actually needed it to die to Bowmasters to keep it in check. Think about Ragavan, for example. Ragavan is so good that we really need it to die to Orcish Bowmasters. Even in a world with Orcish Bowmasters, it's still the second most played creature in Modern behind Orcish Bowmasters, because it's a 1-drop that can snowball to a victory all by itself. Maybe Ocelot Pride is like that, and I can kind of see it, right? With its token production and eventually token production plus doubling your tokens, this is a 1-mana 1/1 that, if it sticks out, can just snowball into a victory and win you a game by itself. So maybe it's possible that Wizards tested this card with more toughness and was like, you know what, we actually need this one to get sniped by Bowmasters so we don't end up with another Ragavan situation. The other possibility is Wizards didn't really design this card for Modern. Maybe this card is supposed to be a commander card, and they just don't really care if it dies to Bowmasters because its purpose isn't to be a good Modern card. I think that the first is the most likely of the two. I think this card was designed to be able to see Modern play, and I think Wizards found out that this card was really, really strong and intentionally decided to give it 1 toughness to die to Bowmaster, because you know that they know it dies to Bowmaster. We see that in so many cards in this set getting that extra toughness, so if Wizards intentionally made this a 1/1, I think this card is really pushed and it needs to die to Bowmasters, which I guess is good and bad. It means the card is probably really strong, but it also means it lines up really poorly with the most played creature in the format. There are ways around this, of course. Any sort of Anthem effect, Flowering of the White Tree, Force of Virtue, to boost Ocelot Pride's toughness, gets it out of Bowmaster's range, and these cards work really well with Ocelot Pride's token production too, because all your 1/1s are going to be 2/2s as long as you get an Anthem out. So maybe that's how you play this card, is just like turn 1 Ocelot Pride, turn 2 Force of Virtue for free, Flowering of the White Tree for 2 mana, just to make sure you don't die to Bowmasters and then just try to snowball into a victory. Outside of Modern, I do think this is a really good commander card. It works well in any deck that cares about cats in Commander, and it works even better in some specific cat decks, because there's a decent amount of cat decks that care about token production. Think about Reigning Siri. When you cast dogs, you make cats. When you cast cats, you make dogs. Jetmir is a cat deck that cares about tokens because you want to go super wide, or Ginny Fae makes a ton of tokens. Kemba even makes tokens. In decks like this, Ocelot Pride seems like an absurd 1-drop. In Commander, you're going to be able to chip in for some attacks early in the game because someone's not going to have creatures, and you'll gain the life, start making more cat tokens, and then you'll quickly ascend, and then you'll just make these extra tokens with your commander, your other effects, and this will start doubling them up and just take over the game really, really fast. It also seems pretty good in some token decks that are not cat related, especially like Trostani Selesnia's Voice, which makes big tokens thanks to Populate and naturally gains your life, or Bernard Ginger Sculptor. Remember, Ocelot Pride doesn't just double up your creature tokens, it doubles up any tokens that enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So maybe you make a bunch of food tokens with Bernard, which you can sack some to gain life, and then Ocelot Pride doubles them up. It's going to get out of hand really, really quickly. In that last mode, can do some wild things with like Dockside Extortionist or some Lannis style decks that just make huge piles of these trinkety tokens. Ocelot Pride doubling them up on your end step is a ridiculously strong effect. So Ocelot Pride, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think this card is actually really strong. I am worried that it only has 1 toughness, but I think that having 1 toughness has to be a sign of how strong Wizards thinks this card is, and them intentionally wanting it to die to Orcish Bowmasters. That's the only thing that really makes sense to me. So we'll have to see. It does line up really poorly with Bowmasters. Creatures with 1 toughness don't have a very good track record in recent Modern, so that is a concern, but the card does a lot of things. In worst case, it is going to be really sweet in cat decks and in token decks in Commander. We also got a weird new 3-drop in Dreamtide Whale. So Dreamtide Whale, 3 mana, 7/5. It's a blue creature. It has Vanishing of 2, so it enters the battlefield with 2 time counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you got to remove a time counter from it. When the last one's removed, you got to sacrifice it, and then it says when a player casts their second spell each turn, Proliferate. So this card is super wonky. By itself, you play it, you get this massive 3-drop, one of the biggest 3-drops in the game. The problem is, because of Vanishing 2, you only really get to keep it for a turn, really. So you play it on turn 1, your next upkeep, you remove a counter, you're down to 1 vanishing counter. That turn you don't have Summoning Sickness, so you can actually attack with it if you want to. The following turn, you remove the last counter, and it gets sacrificed. The thing is, its proliferate ability can keep it on the battlefield, so as long as you can consistently keep casting 2 spells in a turn, or your opponent helps you out and maybe cast 2 spells in a turn, then this can proliferate, keep adding more vanishing counters to itself, and also to anything else if you have proliferation synergies. So this card is really hard to judge. At first glance, I want to say, I don't think it's going to be good enough. We've seen like massive vanilla creatures like Rotting Regisaur not really have an impact on Modern. Just being a 3-drop with huge stats isn't enough, and Dreamtide Whale does have a drawback, right? Like, you might not always be able to cast enough spells to keep proliferating and keep it on the battlefield. So I think there are uses for it, though. It seems interesting in energy-style decks because you can proliferate your energy. I don't know, you still got to be able to keep it on the battlefield, but maybe some sort of Primal Prayers combo deck where you're able to like combo off by casting a bunch of creatures, a Serac, so you're always casting 2 spells in a turn, and Dreamtide Whale is just proliferating your energy. You can cast it for free thanks to Primal Prayers. Chthonian Nightmare, it's a good creature to loop if you need to. You sacrifice it, but you're like, you know, whatever, I'll just get it back with Chthonian Nightmare anyway. Or maybe you play it and then proliferate your energy and then sacrifice it to Chthonian Nightmare to get back something else. Works with Amp Raptor to give you some more energy. So it seems good in the energy decks. It also is intriguing with Ledger Shredder. I imagine there's some like dream draw where you're playing this Ledger Shredder mono blue or is it deck, and you're like turn 2 Ledger Shredder, turn 3 Dreamtide Whale into Mishra's Bauble, so you get your second spell, triggers your Dreamtide Whale, triggers your Ledger Shredder, you put a counter on the Ledger Shredder, then you proliferate the counter on the Ledger Shredder, so now it's a 3/5, and then you proliferate the Dreamtide Whale to keep it around. Something like that seems really explosive and like maybe good enough to actually beat a lot of people in Modern. That's a lot of power on the battlefield really quickly. So I think there are ways to build around this card. Also, good with fight rigging. Fight rigging also hasn't really worked in Modern, and we already got like the big creatures to make it work, so I don't know if this really changes anything. Although it is especially good with fight rigging because the proliferate works with the +1/+1 counter it puts on things. So there are possibilities here. The other place this seems cute, and I think it's actually going to be better in Commander than 60 card formats, is in proliferate style Commander decks, maybe a Troxa or energy decks or toxic/poison decks. Because the thing about Commander is, in Modern, I've definitely played games where someone plays a Ledger Shredder and it just like doesn't trigger for like 2 or 3 turns. If that happens with Dreamtide Whale, it's just gonna die. In Commander though, someone's gonna trigger your Dreamtide Whale. Like, you have 3 opponents each turn cycle before you gotta remove the vanishing counter, and I don't think people, unless you're like threatening to ultimate a Planeswalker with 1 more proliferate or something, I don't think people are gonna be like, okay, I'm just not gonna play my second spell this turn because you might proliferate your Dreamtide Whale. So I expect that people are just gonna play into it, and with 3 opponents doing that, I think you're going to actually proliferate a ton and be able to keep the whale around forever, or at least until your opponent rasts your board or whatever. So it seems to line up really well with Commander just because you have more people who are playing games, more people that can cast their second spell. In Modern, I can see uses for it, but we don't have any track record of vanishing creatures actually being good in Modern, and even though this one does have a built-in way to potentially keep itself alive, it still seems kinda risky and like it could go very, very wrong if you don't have the right draw. So we'll have to wait and see. On the other hand, being able to potentially proliferate for free every turn, and maybe doing your opponent's turns as well, just for playing the game, is a really powerful effect in decks that can use it. We also got a new legendary demon in Shilgengar, Sire of Flame. So a 5-mana 6/6 flying mono black elder demon. It has sacrificed another creature to create a blood token. If you sacked an angel this way, create a number of blood tokens equal to its toughness instead, and then pay 3 hybrid Orzhov mana, sack 6 blood tokens, return each creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Those creatures are vampires in addition to their other types. So if you think about what Shilgengar is, it's essentially like a Doom Whisperer body, so a 5-mana 6/6 fire, no trample, but still close enough, along with Woe Strider's ability, sort of, like you sack a creature, instead of scrying, you get a blood token, but it's a free repeatable sack outlet, and then eventually you Rise of the Dark Realms, your own graveyard, once you sack enough stuff to get enough blood counters. I will say, I don't think this card is really designed for Modern. 5 mana 6/6, it sounds big, but in the context of Modern, it's just like kind of slow, and I don't think you can really like do its thing. If you think about what this card wants, you need to play it, sacrifice either Angels or 6 things, and then have 3 extra mana to be able to reanimate all your stuff temporarily, well, not temporarily, but with a finality counter, which makes it tricky to loop, but we'll talk more about that in the future. So I don't think you can just jam this in some like Cauldron Familiar deck and be, well, just sack my cat once in a while and get value out of it. That's not going to be good enough. There are some Angels that let you speed it up, like you could Death Pack Angel and sack it and get 5 bloods, or put Angelic Destiny on something to turn it into an Angel and then sack it and probably get enough blood to just immediately reanimate for 3 mana. But all this said, 5 mana, doesn't protect itself, needs extra mana for its ability, is pretty slow and janky unless you're sacking Angels, which seems tough to do. All around, it seems like a tough thing to pull off in Modern. On the other hand, it seems like a fun commander card. It reminds me a little bit of Regna and Krav, where you have like demons and angels together, and that's the kind of deck this is likely going to be, right? You're going to be a black and white deck, an Orzhov deck that's led by a demon, but probably wants to play angels for sacrifice purposes. There's some combo potential here. Obviously, you can just play it fairly and like sack stuff, eventually reanimate stuff. The easiest combo potential involves getting rid of the finality counter. So the finality counter, if you don't know what that does, basically just means once a creature has that, if it dies, it goes to exile instead of going back to your graveyard. But there are ways you can set up loops to get rid of those counters to be able to just keep looping your graveyard over and over and over again. So for example, Thief of Blood, this weird vampire that when it ETBs, you remove all counters from all permanents. It gets a bunch of +1/+1 counters. So you can theoretically use Shilgengar to like sack your entire board, get him in the graveyard, reanimate your entire board, including a Theft of Blood, and then you need like a Restoration Angel to blink the Theft of Blood because of how the timing works, but you reanimate it, you use a Restoration Angel to blink the Theft of Blood so it can remove the finality counter from all of your things, and then you can just loop it again, sack your entire board, get a bunch of blood tokens, get everything in the graveyard, reanimate him again, Theft of Blood comes in, Resto blinks it, gets rid of all the counters, toss in maybe like a Phyrexian Altar if you get enough creatures and you can make infinite mana, or just ETB triggers to kill your opponent on the spot. So there are shenanigans like that. Also, really good with Solemnity, just to get rid of the finality counters. When this card can just be like, sack your entire board, reanimate your entire board, sack your entire board, reanimate your entire board, it straight up just wins you the game. So I think it is worth building around with these counter reduction elimination shenanigans. So Shilgengar, I think the card's super cool. Like, I like it. It seems like a really fun card to build around in Commander. I think it's just a little bit too expensive to really do its thing in Modern. Next up, we get our King Gizzard card of the set in Party Thrasher, a 2-mana 1/4 red lizard wizard. It says non-creature spells you cast from exile have Convoke, so you can tap your creatures to help pay for them. And then it says, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you can discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, you can play that card this turn, and of course, that'll be from exile, so then you can Convoke it out if you want to, as a little bit of ramping. So Party Thrasher shows that even in Modern Horizons 3, you gotta have a card that's good in Prosper, right? It wouldn't be a Magic set without some sort of card that's good in Prosper, and the card is good in Prosper. It does exactly what Prosper wants. More importantly, though, this card might kind of be good in Modern. It's a 2-mana 1/4. It dodges bow, it blocks early game creatures like Ragavan or Bowmasters for days, and then it generates sneaky card advantage and even mana advantage if you're able to Convoke things out. And it's card advantage that doesn't care about things like Shieldred or Orcish Bowmasters, because you're not technically drawing cards. Plus, it has the upside of putting cards in your graveyard. We've seen that with Inti sometimes. Sometimes discarding a card and getting in your graveyard can be an upside. And then its trigger, it's kind of like a Ren's Resolve, or maybe more specifically like a Spell Unlucky Witness, because you only do get to cast one of the 2 cards that it exiles. You got to choose the best of the 2 and use that card. You can't actually play both of them. So what do we do with this card in Modern? And I think, number one, we do have some cards that are played that let you cast things from exile. Think about Inti or Ragavan or even Ren's Resolve Questing Druid. So in a deck that's already playing these effects, it's a pretty interesting option. It's generating card advantage, it's generating mana advantage, and it's sitting out there and blocking all day. The only thing I'll say is it's probably not going to be the best in some of the prowess decks that really like questing druid effects, just because it is only a 1/4, it doesn't have prowess or anything, and plus you don't really want to tap your prowess creatures to convoke things, you really want to be attacking with them, so it'll be interesting to see exactly where this fits. Worth mentioning, it only works with non-creature spells from exile, which means it's not good with adventures in specific. Adventures, you tend to have the spell half, and then it goes to exile, and you cast the creature half, so you can't like tap your creatures to convoke out a Bone Crusher Giant, because it's going to be a creature spell, not a non-creature spell from exile, which does limit some of the possibilities of the card. I wonder if there could actually be a full-on combo deck built around this. I'm imagining something with like Young Pyromancer, Third Path Iconoclast, these creatures that make tokens whenever you cast a non-creature spell. You get out Party Thrasher, and then you like Ren's Resolve to draw some cards and also make some tokens, and then you can tap those tokens to cast another Ren's Resolve that you drew, or a Reckless Impulse that you drew, or a Cresting Druid that you drew, and that'll make more tokens, and then you can tap them to cast another Ren's Resolve or Reckless Impulse. So there could be some weird like Creature Storm style combo deck with this card. In Commander, as I said before, it's actually good in Prosper. I know it's a meme, but this one actually is really good in Prosper. And anything like Prosper, which means Feldorn, Rocco Street Chef, anything that cares about you casting cards from exile. So if that's what your deck's trying to do, I think this is a really solid 2-drop that does exactly what you want in Commander, which is ramp you and generate card advantage. So Party Thrasher, because of its 1/4 stats and its kind of intriguing abilities, I think this card has a shot in Modern. I don't have a deck in specific, like an existing tier deck, that I think this just immediately slots into, but I do think this card has enough upside and enough text on it in a big enough butt that it could play a role in Modern. We also got a pretty scary new Eldrazi, an Eldrazi Linebreaker. So Eldrazi Linebreaker, 1 a colorless and a red. For an Eldrazi, it's a 3/3 for 3. It has Devoid, so it's colorless. It is Trample, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains haste and gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of Eldrazi you control. So what this means is, by itself, if this is the first Eldrazi that you cast, it's essentially a 4/3 Trample Haster for 3, which is actually a pretty good body. And then of course, if you get more Eldrazi on the battlefield, it gets even scarier. And remember, this can give future Eldrazi haste, so this can hasten itself the first turn, and then the next turn you cast a Thought-Knot Seer or whatever, and then haste that in and smash your opponent and get in even more damage. So I think this card has potential to be really good and maybe bring back an old archetype. If you remember Eldrazi in Modern, there was a time where Gruul Eldrazi was a legit tier deck, and it was playing cards like Eldrazi Obligator in the 3-drop slot. I think Eldrazi Linebreaker, along with some of our other new Eldrazi, might bring this deck back. So not only do we have Eldrazi Temple to play Eldrazi Linebreaker on turn 2, we now have Ugin's Labyrinth as well if we build around it. Plus we're getting cards like Thief of Existence, Sowing Microspawn, new additions to like the Gruul / colorless technically because of Devoid Eldrazi deck. So it's going to be interesting to see if someone can build a deck that like mashes all these things together. In that deck, I think Eldrazi Linebreaker is going to be a key 3-drop. It's kind of the opposite of Mana Reshaper. Mana Reshaper is like slow and grindy and generating card advantage. Eldrazi Linebreaker is just like, I'm going to kill you. I'm just going to slam these big Eldrazi at your face turn after turn, and I have Trample, and I'm going to be able to pump my team a bunch. So I think that maybe something like Gruul Eldrazi could come back, and if it does, Eldrazi Linebreaker is going to be a key part of it. On the other hand, this isn't going to be a card for like the big Eldrazi deck. If your plan is to ramp into Ulamog or Emrakul or something like that, you don't really want this card. You want to be playing a bunch of like cheap, efficient Eldrazi that are going to be getting in early in the game to take advantage of this card. So Linebreaker, we'll have to wait and see. We haven't seen like the aggro Eldrazi decks be a thing in quite a while, but if they come back thanks to all this new support in Modern Horizons 3, I expect Linebreaker will very likely be a part of it. We also got a new Storm card in Amphibian Downpour. So Amphibian Downpour is a 3-mana enchantment. It's an aura. It has flash and it has storm, so you're going to copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. It enchants a creature, and it turns enchanted creature into a 1/1 frog with no abilities. So Amphibian Downpour, is essentially Frogify, but with Storm, so you can get a whole bunch of Frogifies, and at first glance you think, okay, this is a pretty safe Storm card, right? It's a defensive Storm card. I'm not really going to be able to use it to kill my opponent. It's kind of like a weird Wrath almost that doesn't even kill the creatures, it just turns them all into legitimate business frogs, essentially. So you think it's a pretty safe card, but if you look at the history of Storm, it turns out that pretty much anything that has the word Storm on it has been abused by someone somewhere to win the game. Like, if people can use Sprouting Vines, which is just a search for a basic land, put it in your hand Storm card, or Weather the Storm, which just gains you 3 life Storm card, to actually, like, be a finisher in a deck, which we have seen in the past, I think it's possible, not in, like, a top tier deck or anything, but I think it's possible that this could actually be an aggro Storm card used to win the game. So how do we use Amphibian Downpour to actually kill our opponent? And the answer is Constellation stuff. There's cards like Sage of Mysteries. Whenever an enchantment ETB is under our control, target player mills 2 cards. There's cards like Grim Guardian. Whenever enchantment ETB is under our control, each opponent loses a life. There's even just like Eidolon Blossoms, which just will draw us a ton of cards. So in a deck that's playing some of these cards, we can kind of turn Amphibian Downpour into a weird Grape Shot where we cast a bunch of spells, we have our Grim Guardian, then we Amphibian Downpour, and remember, we can put the aura on the same creature, right? It's not like the Wicked Rolls or whatever that we got in Standard, so even there does have to be a creature on the battlefield for this to work, but we can put all the auras on the same creature if we want to. So all we need is one creature on the battlefield, we just stack up all the auras on it, trigger our Constellation stuff a bunch of times, and win the game that way. Also, it's kind of like a fog. I guess maybe we're entering the frog meta now, where if your opponent goes to attack you with a bunch of big creatures, you can, you know, maybe cast some spells. Also, Storm counts your opponent's spells, so if your opponent casts some spells, that's going to help. And then you just instant speed after your opponent attacks, turn all of your opponent's creatures into frogs with no abilities, which is especially relevant in Commander, because in Commander, in some ways, it's better to like turn a commander into a creature with no abilities than actually just kill it, because if you kill it, then your opponent can just recast it from the command zone. So this actually seems like really good commander removal, to the point where if you're playing a deck that can cast a lot of spells, some sort of spell slinger deck or storm style deck, this might just be the best blue Wrath, quote unquote, in the format. Like, I know it's not a real Wrath, the creatures are not going away forever, and it does have downsides. Like, if your opponent has a bunch of +1/+1 counters on a creature, that creature's still going to be big even as a 1/1 frog with no abilities. So there is some drawbacks there, but I think this is a card that I would play in a lot of commander decks, especially decks where I can reasonably cast enough spells to put a copy of Amphibian Downpour on each of my opponent's creatures. So I think Amphibian Downpour, like a janky against the odds card for Modern. I would be very surprised if this actually was a competitive thing in Modern. I do think the Constellation Storm plan is hilarious, and I plan on trying that at some point. But in Commander, I think this is just a legit good card in a deck that can cast a bunch of spells in a turn. We also got a new to Modern reprint in Branching Evolution. So Branching Evolution, 3-mana enchantment. It says, if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. So this is essentially a more expensive but more powerful Hardened Scales. Hardened Scales just always gives you an additional counter. This doubles the counters. It's quite literally half of Doubling Season for half of its mana cost rounded up, I guess. So the question is this card actually Modern playable? And my first thought was, okay, if this card is going to see play, it's going to be in like a Hardened Scales deck, right? So I started looking at Hardened Scales decks, and it turns out you're probably not going to play Branching Evolution in Hardened Scales, because almost every single card in Hardened Scales works exactly the same with Hardened Scales as it did with Branching Evolution, because there are a bunch of effects that put one counter on things. So obviously, if you're putting a single counter on a creature with Egg of the Soul Cauldron, doubling that equals 2 counters. Hardened Scales adding +1 counter also equals 2 counters. So in Hardened Scales, it's pretty much just 3 mana Hardened Scales. There are some like fringe exceptions, the biggest being Arcbound Ravager. Like if you can get a ton of counters on Ravager, a ton of counters on Zabaz, and then you're able to like sack that and put double the amount of counters on another creature, that is pretty explosive. So I don't know, maybe there's a world where you can play like one copy, but the fact that it doesn't really work that well with Egg of the Soul Cauldron or Walking Ballista or even even just Zabaz or Ravager entering the battlefield makes me think that Hardened Scales is probably still just going to be better because it's cheaper. Where the card could shine is in a deck that doesn't really exist yet. Maybe some sort of like Bristly Bill style deck where Bristly Bill can put a bunch of counters on things and then it can double the amount of counters on things. And if you double the amount of counters on things with a Branching Evolution, you double the doubling and just get a ridiculous amount of counters and like Voltron one-shot kill your opponent or something. So there are ways you can build around this card. I love the card. Super duper cool card. But I think probably more of like a fun brew around than an actual competitive Modern card. We also got, speaking of reprints, one that I do think could be pretty good in Modern, in Sevinne's Reclamation. So Sevinne's Reclamation, 3 mana sorcery that essentially is a Sun Titan ETB trigger. Return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then it has flashback of 5, and if you flash it back and cast it from your graveyard, then you get to copy it. So you do it twice, and you'll get back 2 things with mana value 3 or less. So Sevinne's Reclamation, it is a Commander precon card that was printed for Commander, but it's actually seen a lot of Legacy play. It shows up in like Stoneforge Mystic style decks. It just has a bunch of things that are cheap enough to return. It shows up in some like Crucible of Worlds Trinosphere Stacks decks. It shows up in some Planeswalker decks. This goes back to Fairy, it gets to back Narset, a lot of the War of the Spark Planeswalkers. So I should say, this play is mostly like one-of style play, where this is a nice like, yeah, you killed my Teferi, I can get it back style of card, and then you get the value of getting it back from the graveyard with flashback and doing it twice. So I don't think this is going to be like a 4 of in Modern or anything, but I certainly think it's of a power level that it will see some amount of play in Modern. If it's good enough for Legacy, it's probably good enough for Modern. The first thing I thought of was it seems really good in the Amiria decks. Amiria tends to have a bunch of really cheap creatures that you want to get back from the graveyard. Your Ranger Captain of Eos, your Martyr of Sands, plus you get the upside of getting back like an Abiding Grace that your opponent besieges or something. So I certainly think it could play a role in the Amiria kind of grindy Martyr proc style decks. Plus, it works well with things that can get this in the graveyard. That's the other trick to this card. So Dragon Rage Channeler, obviously you can surveil it away. Territorial Cav, you can loot it away. Really good with Fable the Mirror Breaker, Liliana, where you can just discard this and then later, once your Fable dies or your Liliana dies, use it to get back Fable and Liliana, since you're going to get 2 copies of it. So I think there's a lot of potential uses for this card. So like I said, I don't think this card's broken. I don't think it's like format defining or anything, but I do think we will see this card seeing play in Modern in those grindy mid-range decks that can get it in the graveyard or just have important pieces that they need to protect from removal and be able to get back to execute their combo and win the game. So Sevinne's Reclamation, pretty hyped about this one actually. I love the Sun Titan effects, and this is a really good competitive option. Moving to the world of lower rarity cards, we got a few worth shouting out today, starting with 2 more MDFCs in Hydroelectric Specimen and Bogart Trawler. So Hydroelectric Specimen, 3 mana 1/4, flash. When ETBs, you can change the target of an instant or sorcery spell with a single target to Hydroelectric Specimen. Also, a blue land that can come into play untapped if you pay 3 life. So this is a card that I think it's more of like a niche thing for specific decks or situations. I don't think it's like just going to show up in every deck, but it's pretty sweet that you can cast this to like redirect a removal spell from your more important pieces. The other one is Bogart Trawler, which is essentially reverse Bojuka Bog. So its front side is a 3 mana 3/1 that when it ETBs exile target player's graveyard, the backside, a land that makes black, can come into play tapped if you pay 3 life. So I think it's probably worse than Bojuka Bog just because you can tutor up Bojuka Bog with like land-based synergies, and Bojuka Bog is free, right? Like if you just need to exile the graveyard right away, you just play your land drop, you get a tap land, which is a drawback, but it just does it right away for no mana. Bogart Trawler, if you want to exile the graveyard, you do need to spend 3 mana on it, but in all honesty, I think I'll play Bogart Trawler in pretty much every black commander deck like I do Bojuka Bog. In Hydroelectric Specimen, I think in Commander in specific, is a card I would also play in a lot of decks. So I think these are kind of like fringe-ish for Modern, maybe for like specific decks. Obviously good if you're trying to win with Belcher or other decks that like can't play any real lands, those weird combo decks, but just playing them for value, probably like on the fringes, even though coming into play untapped does help a ton. In Commander, they're just legit bombs, and Commander mana bases are going to be wild after this set. I'm already having trouble finding room for like my 5 basic lands in my Commander deck because there's so many good MDFCs, so many good utility lands, and now that we're getting all these new ones for Modern Horizons as well, it's going to get even tougher. So I guess pack your Ruinations and you're going to be good. We also got Lion Umbra. So Lion Umbra, double green aura. It enchants a modified creature. So the creature must be equipped, have an aura on it, or have a counter on it. And it gives enchanted creature +3/+3 vigilance and reach. And it has Umbra armor, which used to be totem armor, where if it would be destroyed, instead the aura gets destroyed and you get to keep your creature. So we've seen totem armors be very good in Boggle style decks. Hyena Umbra, Spider Umbra, Lion Umbra, it reminds me a little bit of Daybreak Coronet in the sense that you already need your creature to be modified to be able to cast it, so this can't be the first aura that you cast on a creature. It doesn't quite have as good of text as Daybreak Coronet, you don't get lifelink out of it, but still, it's kind of reasonably similar. The question is, would a deck like Boggles play this? And I'm kind of on the fence. In a weird way, 2 mana is like a lot of mana for Boggles, and if you just want the totem armor effect, I imagine you stick with Hyena Umbra or Spider Umbra. But I could see this showing up as like a one-of kind of backup Daybreak Coronet, backup totem armor effect in a Boggle style deck. We also got Reiterating Bolt. So 1 in a red sorcery, you deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, but you can replicate it by paying 3 energy. So you can pay 3 energy as many times as you want. Each time you do, you get to copy it. You can choose new targets for the copy. So this card's notable just because it could be good in an energy deck. Obviously, Lightning Strike that can't even hit your opponent's face, not a modern playable card, but if you think about it, in an energy deck where you can easily replicate this can be for 2 mana in 3 energy, deals 6 damage to a creature, so kind of like a bad Unholy Heat, but you get the upside that you can split it up. Maybe you want to kill like a Stoneforge and an Orcish Bowmaster, so Grief and a Daughty Voidwalker. If you got the energy, being able to like spread this around, it could even turn into a 2 mana Wrath if you have enough energy. So I don't think this is a staple or anything, but if there's a dedicated energy deck that just makes a ton of energy, I could at least see this being an interesting sideboard option where you get like an under the curve removal spell on its face, but thanks to Replicate can actually take down big creatures or take down multiple creatures. We also got Planar Genesis. So Planar Genesis, 1 in a green instant, look at the top 4 cards of your library, you can put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, you can put a card from among them into your hand. The rest go on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this looks kind of like Growth Spiral, and I guess it works sort of like Growth Spiral, although really it's like an Elvish Rejuvenator mixed with an Impulse. You dig 4 cards deep, if you find a land that you want, you put it into play. If you don't find a land, well, then you Impulse and you get to put it in your hand. I think this card can be pretty good. I don't know if it's quite as good as Growth Spiral, and Growth Spiral doesn't actually see any modern play right now. I guess the biggest upside of this card actually is it doesn't get got by Orcish Bowmasters. It's kind of like a Growth Spiral that doesn't actually draw you a card. If you do draw a card, you're impulsing, so you're not getting a Orcish Bowmasters trigger out of it. So maybe it could serve a purpose. Like, it is flexible, right? In the early game, you probably want the land to ramp, and 4 cards is not guaranteed to hit a land, but likely you'll hit a land among 4 cards. And then in the late game, when you already have too many lands, you don't really need another land, you just turn it into an Impulse and dig for your finisher or whatever. So I certainly think this card could see a role in Modern. We also got a reprint in Decree of Justice, which is a pretty iconic card from like 20 years ago. So it is 4 mana double X to create X 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying. Absolutely horrible rate. So you're paying 6 mana to make a single 4/4 flyer, 8 mana to make 2 of them. It's really, really bad. The exciting part of the card is it has a cycling ability. You can cycle it for 3 mana, and when you cycle it, you can pay X. If you do, create X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. This card, it'll be interesting to see if it's good enough. So if you're playing this card, you're playing it almost exclusively to cycle it and make soldiers. We've seen Shark Typhoon be actually a pretty good card, and in a lot of ways Decree of Justice is kind of like Shark Typhoon in the sense that you can cycle it and add some bodies to the battlefield. Shark Typhoon makes 1 big body that has flying, which is nice and can close out the game well, but does die to a single removal spell. Decree of Justice makes a whole bunch of little bodies, which maybe you can just go wide and overwhelm your opponent. So we'll have to wait and see. I think Shark Typhoon probably better overall, but Decree of Justice works in a similar way and is close enough that I could see it serving a purpose. We also got the best equipment in the history of Magic, and it's a common somehow, in Colossal Dreadmask. So Colossal Dreadmask, it's Colossal Dreadmaw. but a living weapon. 6 mana, living weapon. It gives a creature +6/+6 in trample, and you can equip it for 5. So it's literally Colossal Dreadmaw, except you can move it around to other creatures. So obviously not really gonna see a ton of play, but really nice meme recognition by Wizards. We also got maybe the most important uncommon for Modern from the set in Vexing Bauble. So Vexing Bauble, 1 mana artifact, says when a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell, and then you can pay 1, tap, sack it to draw a card. So this is a really great answer to some of the biggest problems we have in Modern. The Evoke Elementals being evoked into play, Crashing Footfalls, Living End, which are casted for free by suspending or cascading. This is going to shut down a lot of the best cards and best decks in Modern, and I think this maybe just does it better than anything else. I think it's kind of competing with Chalice of the Void, right? Chalice of the Void is played to shut down Crashing Footfalls, shut down Living End style effects. Vexing Bauble does that, but it gives you additional upside by shutting down the Evoke mode on the Evoke Elementals. So I think this is mostly better at Chalice of the Void, especially if you're just playing Chalice to hate on like the cascade effects. And then you get the upside of having this Soul Guide Lantern effect mixed in, where you can sack it to draw a card, which maybe makes it main deck playable. I think it is definitely main deck playable in Urza Saga decks. If you're playing a Saga deck, I think this is immediately, in our current meta, part of your Saga package in your main deck. If you're not playing a Saga deck, it's probably a sideboard card, although the fact that you can sack it to draw a card does make it much more palatable to play in your main deck, and I think that's going to be a big deal on Arena in specific for Best of One, where this would be the kind of narrow effect that you really can't play in your main deck, but the fact that you can always cycle it away for a mana makes it a lot easier to do that. And on Arena, this might be one of the better answers to Omni-Tell decks, where you see these show and tell decks putting Omniscience into play, trying to cast everything for free. Obviously, if you got Vexing Bauble down, you just counter all the things that your opponent cast off Omniscience. My only question for this card is this actually enough to stop grief scamming? And I'm not sure that it is. I'm still kind of in the like, just ban grief camp, Wizards. Like, that's kind of still where I land. The problem I have with this for stopping grief scam is, well, first off, you gotta have it in your opening hand. More importantly, there's something outside of your control, which is you need to be on the play. If you're on the draw and you have Vexing Bauble, your opponent just scams you before you even get to put this on the battlefield. We need like this to be a ley line almost. It needs to be, if it's in your opening hand, it just starts on the battlefield, then it would actually answer the grief scam. As it is, it's cool, it's powerful, it's definitely gonna see play, but I'm not sure it actually just like ends the reign of grief scamming in Modern. We also got a super funny new green enchantment that I gotta shout out just because you can build a super sweet deck around it, and that is Monstrous Vortex. So Monstrous Vortex, 4 mana green enchantment. It says when you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. So just so it's clear, discover like Cascade, you'll go until you hit a card of the right mana value, you get to cast it for free, so it is potentially repeatable. You can cast a creature spell, discover into another creature spell, as long as it meets the conditions of Monstrous Vortex, you discover again and discover again. So how do you build around this card? And the answer is ball lightning effects of all things. So someone sent me a deck list of this, and it looked really funny, and I had to talk about it. So the idea of the deck is ball lightning effects, like ball lightning or lightning skelemental. They are 3 mana creatures that have power of 6. So if you cast one with a Monstrous Vortex out, it's got high enough power to trigger the Vortex, and you'll discover for 3. So if you build your deck like a Cascade deck in Modern, where none of your other cards are cheap enough for you to discover into, what you can do is cast a ball lightning, trigger Monstrous Vortex, discover into another ball lightning, which will trigger Monstrous Vortex, which will discover into another ball lightning, which will trigger Monstrous Vortex, which will trigger into another ball lightning, and you basically do that till you put all your ball lightnings and all your lightning skelementals on the battlefield, and they all have haste, and you just smash your opponent for this hilariously janky amount of damage. The Monstrous Vortex, I think it's like a janky build around. It is a really cool janky build around. I don't expect it to like break the format or anything, but I am really excited to try the ball lightning deck because it sounds absolutely hilarious when it works. Finally today, a bunch of other lore rarity cards. You can check them all out over on MTGPreviews.com. And that brings us to the end of our daily Modern Horizons 3 spoilers for the day. And we're actually nearing the very end of main set spoilers. We might have one more spoiler video video, pretty much the full set has been revealed. I think there's a few more cards, so I think we will probably get a video tomorrow, at least one more video, but we are getting very near the end. The good news is, today marks the start of Commander previews for Modern Horizons 3. So for the next 3 days, WotC is going to be showing off the new Commander precons. Tomer's going to be covering all those. We're on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so if you want to see this super spicy new Tarmogoyf Energy Modern Horizons 3 Commander decks, make sure to head over there for that. So anyway, everyone, that brings us to the end of our spoilers for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? We can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the one where we ranked all the lose the game cards in Magic from hardest to easiest.